This is Chapter 8D on the intercept of a straight line graph. In this chapter, you'll learn what a y-intercept is, how to find the y-intercept of a line on a graph, and how to find the y-intercept of a line from an equation. So first of all, what is a y-intercept? A y-intercept is basically the coordinate where it crosses the y-axis. So if this is our y-axis, and we look at line A, it crosses the y-axis at this coordinate. And this coordinate right here is 0 for x and up 3 for y. So the y-intercept of line A is 0, 3. Then on line B, it crosses the y-axis at this point, which is 0 for x and -2 for y. Therefore, the y-intercept of line B is 0, -2. And when we just basically talk about y-intercepts, we would say the y-intercept of A is just 3, and the y-intercept of line B is -2. Now, let's look at finding y-intercepts from a line. So this diagram shows the graphs of y equals 2x plus 3, y equals 2x plus 1, y equals 2x, y equals 2x minus 2, and y equals 2x minus 4. Describe the similarities and differences of these lines. Then find the y-intercept of each line. So at this time, pause. So if we look at all these lines, the similarities is the fact that they all have a gradient of 2. And by having a gradient of 2, they all have the same steepness. So you'll notice that they all travel the same way. They're all parallel to each other. So lines with a similar gradient will be parallel. Now the differences of these lines is simply where they cross the y-axis. So they all have different y-intercepts. So the y-intercept of this purple line is -4. The y-intercept of the pink line is -2. The y-intercept of this yellow-greenish line is 0. The y-intercept of the blue line is 1. And the y-intercept of this orange line is between 2 and 4, which happens to be 3. Now, the last skill is the y-intercept from an equation. Without drawing any graphs, find the y-intercept of these lines. Now, as we talked about in the previous chapter, the number next to x, this is always your gradient. And the number that is not attached to the x, it's standing solo by itself, that is always your y-intercept, no matter what. So in the first equation, y equals 4x plus 2, your y-intercept is equal to +2. Now at this time, pause and find the y-intercept of the rest. So for B, the y-intercept is -5. In C, it's just been rearranged. Your 5 is next to the x, that's your gradient, so your y-intercept is 9. In D, there isn't one, so your y-intercept is actually 0. So it crosses the y-axis at 0. In E, it gets a little bit tricky because y and the number is on the same side. So using our algebra skills, we have to rearrange it so that y is isolated by itself. So if we know y plus 7 equals 3x, let's isolate y by moving the 7, positive 7 over. So that leaves y equals 3x minus 7, because anytime you move a number across the equal sign, it becomes its opposite. So the y-intercept of E is minus 7. And for this one, it's the same idea. If we have the expression y minus 10 equals 9x, let's isolate y because we want to make sure y is always by itself. Let's move it over. So y equals 9x plus 10. Therefore, your y-intercept is positive 10. That's it.